As my collection of videos grows here, I start to connect dots. And EMI Records, the record label, is something that's been coming on my radar more and more as I research groups. It kind of started with the Queen's Reich blog I did, where I noticed that EMI, who's a British record label, I was asking myself, why did this huge record label take an interest in this obscure heavy metal band in Seattle during a time where Seattle was just not happening? I mean, we're talking about 1982, 83. This is way before the grunge thing. And at that point, Jimi Hendrix was the only thing that really put Seattle on the map. They were kind of they weren't very significant. And this huge record label just decides to get behind this record label that, you know, represented Pink Floyd and Kraftwerk and the Beatles, some of the biggest bands ever, all of a sudden gets behind this obscure, heavy metal band from the underground of Seattle. So there's some interesting connections I've been noticing, and they have to do with the Nazis, actually. And being that this is a British multinational record label, I just find it strange. Like, what is this Nazi thing that that keeps presenting itself to me? So we're going to get into that just a little bit here. So I did this blog a while back called The Queen's Reich, and I go into the band Queensryche, who some of you may have heard of. Their biggest song, I think, was called Silent Lucidity. And it was on this album here, Empire, which another song on there was Jet City Woman. That was on the radio a lot. Anyway, it was their biggest, most commercial album. And it came out in the 90s. And I noticed that the album cover had their record label name on it, like not just on it, but inserted into the artwork. And I just found that very strange. I mean, Iron Maiden was on, or probably still is on EMI. And I don't recall them ever putting the three letters EMI next to, Eddie, their mascot, in any of their art. Like, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. It just seems, you could stretch it and take a Andy Warhol sort of perspective on it. Like, Andy Warhol would take a can of Campbell's soup and do it in 5 different colors, and he called that art, But I don't think that's what's going on here. It's just it seems like a weird kind of homage. And in this blog here, I talk about the symbolism of the queen and the queen's realm. And they've got this video called Building Empires, the Building Empires tour. Like, what are you talking about? You're building the empire of the queen. We don't have queens in America, but they do have queens in Europe, in England. And EMI is a British label. And it got me thinking, why is this huge record label that put out the Beatles and Pink Floyd and Kraftwerk and Iron Maiden, why are they interested in this band back in 1982 or 83, whatever it was, this obscure heavy metal band with really cheesy, silly hairdos, and they're barely out of high school, and they're just getting behind this group, and they're touring with Dio before they're even playing any clubs. They're just skipping the clubs and going straight to Dio. There's something going on here. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about contrived, manufactured scenes and bands and things like this. So I'm just getting very interested in this EMI label, and I found I'm finding this strange Nazi connection here. And let me explain what I mean. So Queensryche, the name of their sort of band corporation was Tri-Reich. And sometimes they called this their Tri-Reich symbol here, which kind of looks like the some Batman toy out of his belt or something like that. But it's the Tri-Reich symbol. And as the story goes, there's this big joke about the umlaut. Oh, what's with the umlaut, guys? What does that mean? Well, apparently, and I'm just telling you what Wikipedia says, basically, the popular narrative is that they changed it from R-E-I-C-H to R-Y-C-H-E with the umlaut so that people wouldn't think they were Nazis. Like, the assumption being if you have the word Reich in your band name, somehow, that makes you Nazis, which is silly because the word Reich in and of itself has nothing to do with Nazis. It's just a German word that means realm or castle or something like that. So that's very strange that they're making a point that they don't want to sound like Nazis, okay? And the reason that's strange is because this symbol is called the Tri-Reich symbol, and their corporation is called Tri-Reich. Now, first of all, there were 5 guys in the band: Jeff Tate, Chris DeGarmo, Michael Wilton, Eddie Jackson, and Scott Rockenfield. That's 5 members. So Tri-Reich, it's kind of like 3 Reich. You know, okay, maybe they're taking the Father, Son, Holy Spirit approach. But if there's 5 people in the band, shouldn't it be like Penta-Reich or something? Anyhow, maybe you figured out what's so strange about that, because tri means 3. Third Reich, 3 Reich, Tri-Reich. You know, do you see the hypocrisy there? You know, we don't want to sound like Nazis, so we're going to change the spelling of our band name. But then we're going to call this the Tri-Reich, and we're going to shove that in your face on the front of every album. You see what I mean? So there's some weird Nazi thing. I don't know what it is. It's just very strange. Now we're going to look at another blog I did, which you can find at batshitcave.blogspot.com. There's also a video of it on my YouTube and Rumble pages. This is the Real Sgt. Pepper Part 2. And for those who have no idea what the hell this is basically me taking parts of the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and extrapolating upon it, and mainly focusing upon the album, the Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was released by E.M.I. Records. And I'm not going to get into what it's all about because it's a big can of worms, but it's part of the Paul is dead conspiracy. And the guy talking here, the author that I'm going to be reading, quoting, claims to be William Shepard, aka Billy Shears, the guy who replaced Paul McCartney in the late 60s. Okay, so this is what he said about the album cover for Sgt. Pepper's. I sought for each of us to include our heroes, or legends who were significant to our dead Paul theme. Crowley was not the biblical beast, but was someone whose influence supported the agenda. Hitler, though tied to the same agenda, was alive. John invited him to our simulated funeral. If Hitler had died, he would have met Paul on the other side. John tried to assert an alpha role by refusing to take Hitler off the cover. George Martin urged him to bend on this one. Although he did not care who supported Hitler, he did care about profit. E.M.I. vetoed Hitler's depiction. Discretion prevailed over disclosing E.M.I.'s Nazi affiliation. Martin had to hire mostly ex-Nazis from Germany to play for our recording sessions. Many ex-Nazis, or Nazis still, were on E.M.I.'s payroll. He, John, was glad he was overruled on that one, but still resented his lack of influence on the cover. Album cover is credited to Peter Blake. However, I was the one who told him exactly what I wanted. So there's a lot in there, as you heard. But the main thing I wanted to highlight here was, they're saying basically that George Martin didn't really care about Hitler being on the album cover. And, the thinking here, Billy Shears goes on to explain that the thinking here was that all these people are gathered at a funeral for Paul McCartney, and the question they're asking is who would be there, who would attend, and they're not limiting that to living people. They're saying dead people could be there too. And the thinking behind Hitler was that, well, I guess if Paul McCartney is in hell, then Hitler would be there with him to welcome him, right? It's very morbid, very abstract, and disturbing, frankly. Very disturbing. But look at what he's saying here. Discretion prevailed over disclosing EMI's Nazi affiliation. And you think about, Operation Paperclip, which was, the post-World War II, CIA, MI5, whatever secret deep state organization you want to think of, were basically saying, well, there's all these great scientists, of the Nazi party, just because we're going to, hold Nuremberg trials and execute a bunch of them, doesn't mean we can't utilize a few here and there under the radar without people really knowing, which is kind of strange because it wasn't that under the radar. I mean, Werner von Braun, who we'll talk about more in a moment, came from Nazi Germany. He was a Nazi scientist. Brought him over to America, and he's working for NASA, on the Apollo 11 rocket. So anyway, Billy is very clearly making a connection between the Nazis and EMI, and even talking about Nazis playing on Beatles albums. Now, we know that there were session musicians who played on Beatles albums, and if you want to go deeper on that, go look up the work of Mike Williams, who goes by Sage of Quay. I think his website's called sageofquay.com. He goes way into that stuff. But look at this. He's talking about ex-Nazis or Nazis still who were on EMI's payroll. So another Nazi connection there that I wasn't really looking for. It just sort of popped up in my research across different topics, different bands. And finally, we're going to look at this blog I did called The Kraftwerk of Kraftwerk. And this is part 2 of a 2-part series I did on the band Kraftwerk, which I haven't done a video for yet, but I probably will in the next week or so. So if you don't feel like reading all this at my batshitcave.blogspot.com, I will have a video for it very soon. Anyway, so Kraftwerk, the German krautrock band, immensely influential band. Basically, you wouldn't have, modern hip-hop or dance music, new wave, techno, any of that really without Kraftwerk. They were kind of like the bridge between disco and modern dance music, pop music, basically, electronic music. So when they were on Philips, this record label, they put out 3 albums. They put out Kraftwerk, or I think it was 4 actually. Kraftwerk 1, 2, Ralph and Florian, and then finally Autobahn. And now Autobahn was their big breakthrough album where they had an actual hit in America called Autobahn, and which most of you are probably too young to remember. I'm too young to remember. I discovered this much later in life. But yeah, it was a big hit. They toured America. And the first record they put out on EMI Records was this one, Radioactivity. Now, the weird thing is, as soon as they went to EMI Records, immediately the Nazi thing came out. Now, this is a German band, and we're talking about 1975 or so. And, why would you even want to mess around with that? Especially when you've got this very conservative German image. You don't want to mess around with like anything even remotely close to, Quorthon from the band Bathory used to say in his interviews, the Germans are the most paranoid people ever, because he got a lot of shit for injecting, themes of that could be construed as being pro-Nazi and, pro-white power in his music. And deservedly so, because the themes and imagery was there. And it also is with Kraftwerk. I mean, this radio here, this picture, is a picture of a radio from the Nazi era, and there is a swastika on this radio, but it's been covered up. They chose an actual picture of a radio delivering Nazi propaganda, as we read here from Karl Bartos' book. This is what he said. It is nonetheless still the radio that Joseph Goebbels commissioned for mass production. Hitler's propaganda minister knew that communication between radio and listeners was key, but it wouldn't happen with political messages alone. People were much easier to reach through emotive songs. By coincidence or intention, quite a few things with Kraftwerk seem loaded with historical symbolism. So Karl Bartos was a member of the classic Kraftwerk lineup, and he's on that album. He worked on that album. But what's very interesting is that he's still kind of on the outside. At least that's the impression you get. He's still kind of an outsider in a sense, because he wrote a book. Wolfgang Fleur wrote a book. Those two guys were, kind of like the outsiders. The insiders were Ralph Hutter and Florian Schneider, and they were the ones who hardly ever did interviews, and they never wrote books, and they were always very tight-lipped and not giving stuff away. And all the mystery from Kraftwerk is more to do with Ralph and Florian than it is with Carl and Wolfgang. So when you have Carl revealing something like this, sort of telling you that, I mean, is he telling you what they're doing? You know, is just a continuation of the Nazi regime? Is he saying that the album itself is the propaganda that's coming out of the, you know, the LP, out of the speakers as you play it? And this is something I get a lot more into in the blog if you read it. It's kind of dense. There's a lot of information in there, but like I said, I'm going to do a video of it pretty soon if you want to wait for that. And they talk about Werner von Braun a lot, one of the Operation Paperclip German. This guy is a Nazi, and there's pictures of him with John F. Kennedy in the '60s. He was respected, and you know, here's a quote from Ralph Hutter himself: "We are the children of Werner von Braun and Fritz Lang." Fritz Lang did the film Metropolis, one of the first early science fiction films. And the second album that Kraftwerk did for E.M.I. was Man Machine. Now, they were under their own record label called Kling Klang, I think, at this time, but it wasn't actually totally their own because it was a vanity label. I think that's what they call it. When, you know, a big label like E.M.I. has an artist that's selling a lot, and the artist wants to express their identity a little more. They want to sort of, you know, fool people into thinking they're not connected to a bigger label or something. They give them what's called a vanity label. So Kling Klang was their vanity label, which was basically just an offshoot of E.M.I. And let me just read you what Wolfgang Fleur said in his book about this. Many people later misunderstood the cover shot, finding it too fascist. They were unable to understand that it was pure irony to us. Huge red posters were stuck up all over Paris, showing the cover of our new album, and anyone who didn't know us might actually have found them quite fascist. Everything in the room in which our presentation took place was decorated red, matching the Russian-style album cover. They go into this a lot. Some UK New Music Express printed the interview in its 6th September issue with the new headline, Kraftwerk, the final solution to the musical problem. So I just find this, you know, they're saying that it was irony, that it was comedy or whatever, but for Germans to make jokes sort of referencing fascism and, you know, communism, whatever, in the 70s, it was still a little raw. I mean, World War II was no joke. A lot of people died. And Germany, to this day, still, I'm sure, still holds a lot of guilt. You may not know it to look at it right now in today's climate, but this was considered kind of risque, even in comedy. I mean, you know, if you deliver something through humor or through a novel, the way Billy Shears did, you know, you can put truth in fiction that you couldn't otherwise get away with. So that's about all I wanted to say about that. You know, these off-the-cuff episodes are good to just sort of collect little bits here and there, which, you know, I may later refer to in a larger body of work. So that's about all I wanted to say about that. Just putting it down here for possible reference later. And like I said, I will most likely upload the Kraftwerk video in the next week or so.